Oh, yes. It is another jam-packed episode of the Locked On Nets podcast where today we talk about coaching philosophy. Kevin Durant gives his take on where a head coach is best using his skill set. And we wonder, is that the only thing that matters? The most important attribute that matters, managing personalities? There's a lot of X's and O's that goes into winning playoff basketball that Kevin Durant could be overlooking. We'll discuss it all from a superstar all the way down to the last member of the bench level right after the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
That's right. It's the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Over there, you're going to find Doug Norrie, owner-operator DFSR, for all your daily fantasy sports rankings. DraftKings, FanDuel, he's got you covered. I'm Adam Arbrecht, breaking down the New York Football Giants over on the One Giant podcast with my boy, Andy Mack. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day, free on all those great platforms. And Doug, before we dive in on the Kevin Durant quotes, going back, we'll contextualize when the quotes came out around coaching and what the most important role they play to an NBA team is. A little health check, man. How are you, sir? As the summer heat catches us.
Oh yeah, so we started recording a little bit in the heat wave here over the weekend. As is well documented, one of the world's premier babies when it comes to heat. Is
that the byline of your portfolio?
I'm
well
just one of
documented
the all-time babies when it comes to dealing with heat. I just hate it. And about to move to one of the hottest places on earth for reasons that are not entirely clear. But that's okay. We're going to sweat it off and get used to it. But happy to have the heat breaking a little bit because it's something I think about well in advance of it happening and then think about it almost constantly when it is happening.
Always the classic combination. That being the case, we wanted to talk about Kevin Durant and his coaching perspective because going back to, and just to give context of when it occurred, this is most likely 8-9 months ago when he gives this quote. It's the interview with David Letterman on his Netflix series, discussing everything, both on and off the court in terms of basketball. But ultimately, when they get to what is the role of a head coach, what is the most important role that he plays to a team, Kevin Durant responded with, I think that's the biggest thing. We all know how to play. We all know the terminology. We know every single scheme that can be managing personalities. I think that that's their biggest job. When you hear that, and he started it out as saying managing personalities, that was the number one, and then he followed it up with a little bit of context around it. What's your initial reaction when you hear him say, hey, head coach, it's really just about managing ego, something that we've talked about a lot on the podcast, especially when it pertains to superstar level talent and championship level teams?
Yeah. So, okay. So I know you gave the context around timing. I will be interested to know if this answer has changed for him after the way that, of course, this season just played out. Like, there's a very good chance the interview with Letterman, it was done again, like last year prior to the season starting, right? Like where there was probably a little bit of turmoil. He mentions Harden in the thing as like being a teammate. So like it was clearly done before last season, before the trade. And I'm positive it wasn't in season. Like I'm pretty sure it was like, around that media day. I remember Letterman shows up at that media day, like randomly, and it was like asking weird questions to Durant. So
yes,
I do wonder if this answer would have changed. Okay. So I'm just going to throw that out there that there's been a lot of stuff that's happened between now and then, likely. Okay. So the second part is this the most important thing? I think this is a wider discussion around the NBA in general. I do think that coaching is very different for what level of player you are, right? Like as you get higher up on the hierarchy of superstar, I do think that for a Kevin Durant, managing personalities is probably one of the most important things because he can do, like he says, do and know just about everything on the basketball court. But I don't know if that's the case for every player. And I do think it has to be the case. Like not every player has the skill and knowledge of Kevin Durant. So at some point, if you would agree about that, then you have to agree that at some point coaching has to be more than just managing personalities. He's not saying it's the only thing. He's saying what he finds it to be the most important thing. It'd be hard for me to think that's the case once you start getting into guys who just aren't as good as Kevin Durant. like, because it can't, how could it not be? Like, you're not managing everyone's personality. Some people you just have to make better. And the way you make them better is coaching on a bunch of different stuff that they might not be aware of.
Sure. It's interesting too, because you said with everything that went on this past year, if that's changed for him or not. Certainly the on the court, there's questions to be asked there of Steve Nash, and we're going to get into the coaching staff, obviously, overall here in a little bit. But I wonder if the past season would also reaffirm a little bit of this opinion that he has on, at least from like a regular season perspective, where you go look at everything that happened and what was most important, maybe managing
That's true.
personalities and egos and expectations inside the locker room, as you have a guy like James Harden saying, I don't love what's happening here. I'm probably out. Kyrie Irving isn't available, not with the team. So now you end up with Kevin Durant. And for him, maybe it doesn't even matter as much, or maybe it did, right? Maybe Steve Nash, let's put it to the head coach, was in his ear saying, hey, I get it. This isn't great, but we can get there. We can work our way through this. And then to the lower level guys, to your point, these guys aren't as naturally talented, athletic, and gifted as Kevin Durant is. So how are you propping up some of the lesser players who are supposed to be a part of this team in pursuit of a championship, and yet find themselves in the murky waters of either having to do way more than they were expected to, like a Patty Mills, right? Having to carry bigger loads, and also trying to compete in a season that was supposed to be structured a lot differently, getting to the playoffs and looking to win a championship.
I mean, I will say, like, in Nash's favor on this, like, I think Nash is actually really, really good at this, right? Like,
Right.
he was like sort of like weirdly unflappable all last season when it was completely all over the place. That was a really important thing for the season not going completely off the rails, and it went very much off the rails. But like, it could have, like, imagine a situation where Nash is not dealing with this situation very well, like on a personal and professional level, which would have been totally reasonable, by the way. It was a total mess. Like, the Kyrie situation was a mess. The Harden thing was a mess. I mean, whether you want to say he could have headed that off at the pass, it sure doesn't seem like it. And so, like, Durant's injured. You have 50 different starting lineups. Like, there's a world where Nash is just like, dude, this is not what I signed up for. Like, no coach signs up for this. This is a disaster. He, to his credit, like, was unflappable. Never had a negative word to say about anybody. Like, got thrown under the bus completely on like where he was supposed to be reporting injuries, because like, that was not even totally clear, and they just kind of threw him out to the wolves, like the media wolves, time and time again. Be like, what's up with Ben Simmons? And he would just give some conflicting report. That's not his fault. He's just not giving him information. He's not giving the information.
Are you trading James Harden? No. Yeah, I mean, like
like
literally
he was
walking
just,
out
he
there
was
for
like
that time
total,
after time.
yeah, he was just the total front-facing thing that just took all these bullets and never did anything. So I do think from that perspective, that was very, very important for at least keeping the train a little bit on the track. And you want a guy like him who's had, thousands of media rep hours just as a player, kind of knows what the questions are going to be, knows like how to answer them, knows how to deal with the media. I do think that part is very, very important. Whether it's the most important thing, it's hard to know, but you do have to give credit for Nash kind of at that point. And it's not like managing personalities, but it's just managing situation stuff that's all off court. Like, none of that stuff had really anything to do with what was happening on the court. And he, I think, handled it as good as you possibly could do. So I think from that standpoint, Kevin Durant would probably, that does fit what Kevin Durant's saying. It's like, hey, go out there and kind of manage what this whole situation is. And there's a lot of moving parts, and you're going to do your best. And I mean, some guys might've just quit.
Do you think too? Cause it's funny. Fair enough. Right. Like superstar level talents can quit on things like this. Do you find it a little bit, I'll say a little bit ironic that Kevin Durant is saying managing personalities is among the most important, he said the most important thing, but everything else that goes into it. But given what his personality is, like, in some ways, it feels like Kevin Durant is saying this relative to what other superstar NBA personalities sometimes require, maybe from the experience that he's had in Brooklyn, whether it's with Kyrie, whether it's with James Harden, right? Like, I don't think Kevin Durant doesn't need a lot of personality or ego management. Maybe he does, right? Doesn't seem like it. So in a lot of ways, it's kind of like saying, again, let's bring it back to the top. Very few players have the talent that Kevin Durant does. So when he looks at a head coach, he go, I know all the X's and O's. I'm one of the best players in the game. What I need from a head coach is someone who can manage everyone else, manage these personalities, and get them in line with me, in support of me, for winning championships. Now, that's not ideologically saying that Kevin Durant views himself as that, right? He knows he's an apex predator. He knows he's one of the best. And he's also always communicated team basketball and putting, team above self, all those things. So I think he agrees with all of those aspects, and also understands I need a coach that can galvanize people around me or around the two best players on the team. If you throw in a Kyrie or a Ben Simmons when healthy, et cetera, right? Like that, I think maybe speaks to where his mind goes around this stuff, knowing that he is not necessarily a vocal leader in that same way, where he could be getting on guys on a game to game basis and really talking more where you need to be, what you need to be doing.
Yeah, and I think like from his perspective, it's like nice to have a coach that probably will do a little bit more of that stuff, right? Like a little more cheerleading and things like that. And because Durant is just not going to be that guy, that's going to shift for different players. Some players are going to be more of just like on court generals. I don't think Durant like would
Right.
fit that bill completely. Like he clearly is great, but he's not, controlling every aspect of the game or like, super vocal on the court. If you think of guys, LeBron or even Draymond, they're guys like this that are just like very much dictating, like sort of through their words as much as their actions about like what's happening on the court. I don't think we would put Durant in that kind of vein. I think that Nash is like probably more rah-rah than he is like X's and O's. I think I don't know if that's a fair statement, but it is, but that's fine. Like because like the current leadership doesn't really have that as much either. So it's like, I do think that Kevin Durant probably needs a different kind of coach, and probably for his point of view is saying like managing personalities. Like he says it in the quote too. He says like, he doesn't want to be, he wants to let us, I'm going to paraphrase this. He tells us he wants the coach to let us go eat and let us do our thing. I think that's the best coach. Like he throws that in there, which is to say like, I want to have my freedom. I don't want to be told like have a bunch of rules around it.
Sure.
Now, maybe Kevin Durant is the kind of guy where he doesn't need a bunch of rules because the work ethic is unmatched and the talent's unmatched and he doesn't need it. I cannot imagine that's the case for all players though. Like
right.
Okay, well, here's the
superstars or otherwise.
We know it to not be the case. We know that other players, other people, and just people in general, like just humans, different humans need different levels of direction, right? Like not all of them. Some people are free to just go and do your thing, and it's just going to be A+ every time. Some people, we all know them in our life, that are not going to be that case. So I think Durant is speaking really more for himself, but I can't imagine like organizationally that this is the number one thing because there's just too many other players with things that are at different points of development. All right, we have a ton more to talk about here, especially with the Nets coaching staff as well. First, going to talk about our friends over at Prize Picks. NBA fans, you have to get over on Prize Picks. It's the best daily fantasy option for the NBA because it's super easy to use. All you're doing with Prize Picks, you're picking 2 to 5 players. You're going over under on their projections. You can win up to 10x. That's 10 times on any entry, and it's just you versus the projected numbers. You're not in there like other daily fantasy sites, trying to build lineups and up against all these sharks. No, it's just you versus the Prize Pick numbers. Over under, you can pile them all together: points, rebounds, assists, blocks, steals. That's just for the NBA. Maybe you want to go over the MLB. Also, you can combine sports to get those players in there. So it's not just for NBA. NFL time comes around. You throw that in as well for a limited time. Prize Picks has an exclusive no-brainer of an offer for all of our users. You're going to get $50 for free if a player in your first Prize Picks entry scores a single point. You have to use the code NBA. Exclusive offer just for Locked On fans. Sign up today and use the code NBA. $50 for free if a player in your first Prize Picks entry scores a single point. Prize Picks is daily fantasy made easy.
Okay, so the one thing I want to hit here before we get into the coaching staff, and obviously we're going to highlight some of this turnover here. And you mentioned you said philosophically, if the organization isn't a little bit different from that idea of ego or personality manager as the first tenant, I'll actually make the case that is what's most important, and we can break down why when we talk about some of the departures they've had on their staff. But I saw this one quote. This goes back to 2013 from Greg Popovich in an interview with Sports Illustrated. I just thought it was worth highlighting when asked about what is the role and how do you build success for a team. Yes, we're disciplined at what we do, Greg Popovich told Sports Illustrated, but that's not enough. Relationships with people are what it's all about. You have to make players realize you care about them, and they have to care about each other and be interested in each other. Then they start to feel a responsibility towards each other. Then they want to do it for each other.
Yeah.
I will say, like, so maybe that overall heading of, personality manager, you go, oh, is that always enough? And the X's and O's clearly matter. And Greg Popovich gets to make that type of quote statement because he's also one of the best X's and O's NBA coaches in the league history. But when you frame it a little bit deeper like that, I think that that's kind of a part of it too. You say lower level guys, the back end roster players, guys that fill things out. What you do want is some sense of, I'll use the dirty word, culture, where all of these guys that, individually, no, not necessarily the greatest, but the sum of the parts and the fact that maybe Bruce Brown or that Blake Griffin is willing to step in and get his body bowled over in a game, or Patty Mills, because he knows he gets to put on, right, the blue collar boys hat and look over at the bench and see these guys getting hyped up. Different teams have this. Not every championship team necessarily. Do you think back and go, oh, I remember some of the little details on the bench and what the bench mobs were up to? The Nets have had this historically. Hasn't always been in great seasons, but I think that part of it does matter, maybe in the margins, right? Not as much as X's and O's execution, but in the margins, those things can matter.
For sure. And like, I mean, historically, it's been kind of on record that Popovich has been one of the best ever at this thing. Like, he still has, I'm pretty sure, I just know this the case. Like, when he goes into new towns, for games, any ex-player that like played with him, they all go out to dinner together.
Yeah.
Like, that's like a thing. And so it's a minor thing, right? But it's definitely a thing that happens with these guys where it's like, hey, the expectation is like, we all played together. You were on the team. We're part of the same family. That's known. And I don't know if it happens with Kawhi, but I think it happens with just about everybody, like just about everybody else. And like, that's just there's one of like these little signals that like he understands it from top all the way to the bottom, right?
And
like
Kevin Durant experienced that on Team USA with Greg Popovich, right?
Right. And so Popovich has been one of the all-time greats at it. Like, it's it's gonna be hard to compare other coaches to Pop because he's had one of the like greatest coaching resumes ever. But you can try to emulate some of what he does by saying like, hey, these are the tenets that by which we are going to like act and perform and live. And when we do those things, like sort of winning will come, right? Or will exceed expectations. And I think for the most part, the Spurs have exceeded expectations. Like, they easily could have dumpstered this season and tanked. They didn't. They freaking made the play-in, like with a team that probably should not have made the play-in, right? So, and a lot of that was just because, hey, we're not going to tank. We're just going to try to win. Like, that's not the philosophy for a lot of NBA teams, but you do that for enough years and that's just what you end up being. I do think with the Pop thing, as it relates back to the Nets, it's much easier said than done because like, they also came along at a time that just had guys like Duncan who were just like all about that, right? Like, all about just team, keep quiet. Like,
and to your point, and then having to maybe make a difficult choice around someone like a Kawhi Leonard, right? That if it doesn't fit into this mold, the talent, there's a discrepancy there.
Well, that was Kawhi that asked out. Like, Kawhi didn't like how he was being managed with his injury and stuff. And so like, it's not going to be 1-to-1. It's not going to, I guess the point is it's not going to work for everybody.
Right. Yes.
In the grand scheme of things, it seems to have mostly worked. Anyway, with the Nets, again, I think guys like Durant require something different than the other guys on the team. And like, what your job is to make it so that your other players sort of exceed their expectation or their baseline expectation. And I want to believe like historically the Nets have done that, but I'm not sure it's happening with like the same frequency now. And maybe it was happening a little more like with Atkinson, who was like a little bit more of a player development coach along those lines, right? Like, and that was a timeline where we were getting higher expectation than what the baseline was. And maybe Nash is that guy, or maybe he isn't. But the stakes are different now. So it's hard because I think that like your number one goal is to keep Kevin Durant happy. I think is clearly stated, right?
Yes,
like, you have to. Like,
I agree. I concur.
He has to be happy. So kind of the rest of it doesn't matter as much if he's not happy. The problem is if the other things go by the wayside because you're not as good at those things, or there's been tons of coaching turnover and you can't develop, then you are going to it's going to catch you in the end. Like, it's going to limit your upside. I guess that's my point.
Yeah, it's interesting because, like you say, who are players that have benefited from what you would think would be that philosophy coming from Steve Nash down that aligns with what Kevin Durant is saying. Like, obviously, Bruce Brown has been one of those guys, right? I think now Patty Mills coming in this past season, who played underneath Popovich for so many years, probably fits that bill in a lot of ways. I think there's some guys that you can see the success of that philosophy paying off in terms of supporting cast members, and then it has Nicholas, and this isn't, I'm not knocking Nicholas Claxton, but it's like, has he always exuded that same type of mentality? I think some of the veteran players have actually showcased more of that than maybe some of the younger talent. Guys that have exceeded expectations in terms of what they've been able to produce on the court from a young cast standpoint. Well, I don't know if that's necessarily about the, managing their personalities or expectations in a guy like Kessler Edwards or Cam Thomas. That might just be that could actually be about the X's and O's and getting them to execute better or work better in practice to be better than on the court. So it's probably easier to talk about those things when you're not at the level the Nets are wanting to win championships, right?
Well, and also like the X's and O's part, you can't, when KD says, we all know all these plays, right? Which is like kind of what he intimated during the thing. It's
we
like,
get it.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. Like, you made it to the basketball, like the highest levels of basketball, you're going to understand like all the different actions. You're going to, and there's all these different actions: pistol, horns, floppy, Spain, like, like Chicago. There's tons of stuff like that you're going to need to like sort of just know as a baseline expectation. And then like all the defensive, assignments and, and communications and stuff like that. There's a ton of stuff you have to know. And you cannot just assume that if you made it to the NBA that you know it all. That's just definitely not the case. Like, so I think like just kind of passing off the X's and O's stuff as not being as important because all basketball players know it. I just can't buy that. Like, it just can't be true, because we've clearly seen teams that it would seem that year over year exceed their expectations because they have a combination of like culture plus schemes that they just know and can adapt to make them win. The Heat are going through this right now. Like, the Heat are not as talented, you would think, 1-7 as the Celtics are, or some of these other teams, and they are 2 games away from the finals again. And because Spo is considered to be one of the very best coaches in basketball, both on a player level and an X's and O's level. So you can't, it has to be a part of it. And it has to be a big part of it. Like, there's just no way around it.
And that's why, coming up here in a second, in addition to some of the coaching turnover, I'm going to explain why, just because all of the basketball terminology and expectations and execution doesn't mean that you're always capable of executing it the way superstar talent can, using the Miami Heat as a backdrop. But before we do, got to tell you about our friends over at Rock Auto. Guys, I don't know if you're aware of this. If you're on the East Coast, there's some pollen out there and it is coating my car. And when I went to go ahead and give a little spritz of the old windshield wiper fluid, found out that the line running from my wiper fluid reservoir to my wipers was no longer working. That meant that I got to go over to rockauto.com, where I always like to go, because it means that I'm not spending 50, 70, or even 100 times more than going over to my local auto parts store, telling them I need this very specific hose to run from here to here. They say, sure, there you go. Wrong part, wrong make, wrong model, overcharged, and who knows if I'm even getting all my money back on a return. The bottom line is, you go over and use the easy search drop-down menu on rockauto.com. You find the make, the model, and the part that you need, and you know that you're getting it at a great price. When you do go over there, of course, you're going to be on rockauto.com. You can see all those parts available for your car or truck. You write Locked On in their How Did You Hear About Us box, so they know that we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. So the one thing I want to touch on, you mentioned it there. Just because we assume the Bruce Browns of the world, and he's been pretty good. Or Nicholas Claxton, let's take him for an example, right? He's been playing basketball a long time. He's developing. He's been in the league for a number of years in spite of having under 100 career games. Just because all of the X's and O's and what you're supposed to do doesn't mean that situationally, and we see this in playoff basketball, the Miami Heat, even the first round series against the Boston Celtics, it's because you had a lot of guys being coached at a high level and making situational adjustments, having the coach communicate, hey, they're doing something different now against us offensively. Let's switch to X. And knowing that the players can, at the drop of a hat, pivot to that new scheme, to that new function. It doesn't mean, just because you have the playbook doesn't mean you're always equipped to execute it as efficiently and effectively as you need to. And that's where I think timely coaching comes into play, especially as you get into the postseason.
100%. Like, there's no way around it. Like, you have to be able to do this
for
stuff.
Kevin Durant too, by the way, sorry to cut you off. For Kevin Durant too,
Yeah.
because I feel like there are examples inside of what was going to be a losing effort anyway against the Boston Celtics. But there were times when we talked about it on the podcast. Hey, at some point, either they're not coaching correctly, or Kevin Durant is dismissing the coaching that says you can't just dribble down into a double team and hope that things work well out of that. There has to be another method to it.
Yeah, and so and again, just look at some of the teams that are left here in the adjustments. Like, we saw Jason Kidd. Like, there was a great scene of Kidd like switching where they were going to line up, switching where they sat, switching which direction they started the game in, so that he could be more in the Phoenix series, so he could be more involved in the defensive call out and schemes of what they were doing against Phoenix, so he could be right in front of that on the defensive end. It was like they specifically did it. It was a great thing. We've seen Ime Udoka just like coaching in game and doing stuff to make adjustments to make sure that they have their best chance. Like, the coaches that are left here are the ones that are actively making, adjustments over the course of a game, like play Grant Williams a lot more, because that's going to work. Like, all this little stuff like ends up really mattering at this level. And I just don't know if the Nets, like, have had that. Like, I mean, and you know, I mean, this is a good time to just talk about some of this upheaval too, because like
Yeah.
they've had significant coaching upheaval outside of Nash over the first two Nash seasons. Or excuse me, first three Nash seasons. No, sorry, first two Nash seasons. I forgot Atkinson was the first year. Atkinson Vaughn was year one of the KD Kyrie thing, and then they brought in Nash when KD was coming back. So,
Yep.
but look at like the coaches they've lost from their tree. So they lost Ime because he goes and gets the job with the Celtics. Fine, you take the head coaching job. D'Antoni just left. Like he was, now he's in line for another head coaching position now, but he just didn't even just choose to sit on the sidelines for whatever reason. Then you have now this season they're going to lose David Vanderpool almost definitely. He's gone. Looks like Adam Harrington is not going to be with the team anymore. Mark Stein reported that. I mean, that's a lot of coaches that you've and good ones too. Like Vanderpool was a really well respected coach. Obviously, D'Antoni's one of the best to ever do it, and Ime's crushing it with the Celtics. Like this is a lot of brain trust to lose off your bench over just a 2-season span for a guy who, let's not forget, had never coached before last season. And
well,
so
that's just the impact of the coaching tree right there. That's just Steve Nash putting his disciples out into the league, and you're going to see. I mean, look now, Ime Udoka came out from underneath the Steve Nash coaching tree. Look at the success that he's gone on to have. My goodness.
Well, they did
Mike
a great job. I mean,
lucky little upstart could get a head coaching job because of what he did under Steve Nash.
You know, kudos to them for hiring great guys. Like Marks and company hired, like they got Ime from the Sixers, right? Like D'Antoni was like kind of leaving the Rockets and was looking for something else, and so like credit to like putting these guys on the bench. But this is a lot of turnover for a team, for frankly, for a guy that probably needs a lot of help here because, first of all, and that's not a knock on Nash. Every coach needs help. That's why there's 50 million assistant coaches on every team. They all need help. There's lots and lots of moving parts. There's a reason these guys are all on the bench. They all have their roles. They all have sections of the game that they specialize in. They have players that they specialize in. Like that's not something that's talked about, is that typically among the coaching ranks, you kind of work with different players. Like this is this guy's guy. Like this is this guy's guy. And they kind of do that. And they sort of attach themselves within a team to different players that they're going to work with. All of a sudden, all these guys move around. The players are gonna feel that also, right? Like they're not getting the sort of like the same one-on-one like consistency through this rank. So it's all to say, when there's a lot of coaching rank turnover, it's going to be very difficult to maintain consistency around personalities and scheme and all of it. Like it's just even if the guy at the top, Nash, and then Jacques Vaughn, who's second in command, are still there, getting all these other like a good group of guys that just don't maintain is gonna hurt you.
This isn't, and this isn't to say, this is not in any defense of Steve Nash, but it's twofold. First, I just want the quick point of being, you were saying there in the last segment that, how does the organization want to develop this? They certainly care about the X's and O's, et cetera. I'm sure they do. We know that they do.
Oh,
and also, because you have Steve Nash as your head coach, you can make the case that they do see things maybe through that same lens as Kevin Durant. The first most important thing is managing these personalities. The execution, the X's and O's, of course, matter, but we do have this hierarchy board because we've seen some of these coaches go, obviously turn over here over the last couple of seasons. But to your point about, I think the most important part of the turnover, again, and something that Kevin Durant probably looks past, right? He goes, yeah, guys come and go. Either way, I'm working my game. I'm one of the best in the league. I don't necessarily need to worry about some of the positional coaches, some of the guys that are working on the side with the younger players, with developmental players, with the rookies, even with veterans that are trying to be more effective in how they want to execute from a game-to-game standpoint. But everybody else does, though, right?
Yeah.
Like the Bruce Browns of the world. What happened to him? Now, he recovered from that. But a lot of it was because his role completely shifted and it looked different at the start of the year. So he had to reshape his game. I'm sure the staff was instrumental in doing that. Nicholas Claxton is trying to get a little bit bigger, a little bit stronger, trying to be more effective, not bring the ball so low to high when he gets it in and around the basket, be a little bit better in execution from passing out of the post, right? Like all of those things are where every other coaching staff member, including the head coach, come into play in a way that Kevin Durant or the best in the league probably go, yeah, either way. It's why sometimes a guy like LeBron James will jettison a head coach because he doesn't see it as being the most critical piece. And hey, I'm frustrated. Things didn't go well. You get rid of the head coach. And in that situation, in Vogel, let's say, a guy that has a lot of experience in the league, and you go, well, it might not matter to you, but it could matter a lot to other players on this team.
100%. Like you need there has to be consistency there. It's clear that other guys, like we mentioned it from the beginning, it's clear that other guys benefit from having good coaching and consistency because it what's helps them like sort of like know where they're going with their careers and how to get better. Like one thing the NBA, I know why they do it, but they do such a disservice to like actually how much coaching goes into the games. Like when they do these in-game coaching look-ins, right? Like, you get mic'd up, you get a coach mic'd up on the bench or in the locker room. And a lot of it sounds like total rah-rah stuff. Cause like, it's like, come on, work harder, Like, yeah, like, yeah, they do say that, but what you miss is like that's the part that the NBA approved for them to like broadcast because the other stuff is all strategy.
and by the way, and you sometimes catch those little things where they cut away from it when they're starting to diagram, right, what you want to see happen, or on the back end they'll show you the footage of they executed that play exactly as it was drawn up on the sideline, but everything else is going to be to your point.
It's all strategy in there. Like all the rest of it is strategy. It's just not broadcast because they don't want to let on what the NBA has agreed. They're not going to let on what the team's strategy is. It's like why you don't hear the NFL. Now, see, it's funny with the NFL, like the NFL, you don't hear them calling plays in, but it's happening, right? Like it's very clear that each play is a play that's happening. And that's like something the coach designed and like then had the team implement. That is not dissimilar to what's happening in the NBA, except that I don't think people think about it because it looks a lot more fluid. It's like a lot more moving parts. It looks like it's just something that sort of happens, right? Like magically, but that's not the case. And so I guarantee if they were to give those live look-ins and just have it unfiltered, it'd be a totally different experience. You would see coaching in a totally different way. I think loud people just don't see it like that because it's curated in a way that would make it appear that it's just like, hey, I'm the head cheerleader on the team. And if I can just like motivate them enough, they'll go. That's like part of it, but it's like a way smaller part than people realize.
No, and it's what makes the NBA game, I think, so much harder to break down, right? Because to your point, it happens so fluidly on the court. You can see it's 12 possessions in the blink of an eye. NFL, other sports, you can look and go, oh, that was the design of the play. It worked or it didn't work.
And by the way, I'll tell you right now, the NBA announcers are no help with this. Like there are very few. There are very few that are any help with this thing. Like the ex-players are the absolute worst. Like sometimes and it's not their fault. Like they were just really good, and it's hard to convey something.
So Kevin Durant's point, we just all know this stuff.
It's really hard for an ex-player who was really good to convey all of the pieces of the game that came very easily to them, right? Like I'm not saying they didn't work hard; they worked the hardest, but I'm saying like the baseline talent was so good that it's sometimes going to be very difficult for them to convey it in a way that's going to be good for the untrained ear. Some coaches are better at this, like the Van Gundys. Like, I mean, Doris Burke's pretty good. Like there are people out there that, I mean, even Mark Jackson will sometimes have his moments, like not really, but think about how
almost paid Mark Jackson a compliment.
Think about how, I mean, it's just, I mean, whatever, he's fine. Yeah. Think about how little you hear about the X's and O's when you listen to a broadcast. Like you never hear them talk about specific sets and plays. Like they never mention that ever. Like I don't know why. They all know what they are. Like I don't know why they feel the need to not mention it, but like they don't. Like so this is where coaching gets digged a little bit too, because it's like, you are not given a window into even what some of the thought processes are because it's all so surface level. And so I don't know. I'm a little getting far afield here, but
yeah. But the last note I'll make on it is like when you see head coaches putting their hand over their mouth and just, talking behind the bench to other guys. And then you see coaches shifting up and down the bench and then talking to players intermittently. Like that's everything that's happening on an active basis on a play to play where you go, hey, did you see how the defense did this to us? When you get in there, player X, you're going to want to try to create more space in the corner. You're going to want to try to drive harder this way, work the pick and roll, etc. All those things. So the in-game adjustments are certainly something that's fascinating. And to that point, I guess to tie a bow on it, it's what makes it very interesting to see now. What will the Brooklyn Nets do here going forward to reshape this coaching staff under Steve Nash? And to your point, we said at the top, did Kevin Durant's opinion or perspective on this change at all after seeing some of these factors over the course of the season? There's all the off the court stuff that maybe Steve Nash did a great job with. And then when you watch some of these coaches and some of these teams in the playoffs, you can't help but look at it and say, yes, there is a very clear need for this hierarchy of execution and a clear plan of attack when it comes to, if not the superstars, everyone in behind them.
Totally. Like you just see with every team. Just look at by the way, the way to easily see it is just look at some of the minutes redistributions of teams, of guys that have made it this far, of guys just aren't playing as many minutes as they did, even like in a series before. When that happens is because they've made clear choices around like we just have to do something different, right? We have to do something different. That like Kevon Looney is like didn't play at all. Now he plays all the minutes for the Warriors and they're killing. Like that's just a clear change of things he did. Like teams are clearly making adjustments to these situations.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Go ahead.
You know what? Yeah, BTs. But the idea of we talk about like a guy like Andre Drummond who is or is not going to be brought back. We see how bad he was in the series, and you go, this is an example where he shouldn't maybe see the floor at all. And then had the Nets been in the playoffs longer, we might get the sample of making those right choices, right? Using him when it's valuable, and then just flat out taking him off the court when it isn't. And those little margins are something that a lot of fans called for, right? Why aren't we seeing more of LaMarcus Aldridge or Blake Griffin, right, wrong, indifferent? Why didn't we see other versions of this team? That then falls back to head coaching and execution.
Yeah. And I think sometimes it's going to be, you're going to fall in love with the thing that's not there because you think it's going to be better. And there are other times where it's like, hey, it's clearly this thing's not working. And anyway, this is all to say that coaching, I think we would agree, just to put a bow on this one, is that we would agree that coaching is, and it feels like it'd be crazy to think it's not, is like a lot more than just managing personalities. Like I think it needs, but it's what in the end, it's going to be different for everyone. And I think for Kevin Durant, that probably is the most important thing. And I just don't think we can prescribe that to all players. All right, we're going to get out of here. We will be back again later in the week. We might have some word on some contract stuff. If that gets underway, we'll also hopefully get a clearer idea of what's happening with the draft as we get later on to this week with the pick. They don't have to make the decision yet, but we have some other pieces that we're going to talk about. In Nets world, there's always a quote that's coming out. So like, that's no big deal. They are great in always providing you with something. In the meantime, make sure you subscribe over on Locked On Nets YouTube. That all you gotta do is hit the subscribe button there. Leave a comment as well. Try to get into the comments section. So like and subscribe over on YouTube.
Yes, friends. Acting is not an important job in the scheme of things. Plumbing is. Spencer Tracy.
Oh, one of the all-time great poets. We'll be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.